Hello everybody, welcome to Plain Simple. In this video I'm going to explain in layman's terms how to wire auxiliary lights on a vehicle. Additional lights to a car, truck, whatever, a vehicle. Now this video is an answer, a form of an answer to a question that came up in the comments of another one of my videos. And it was exactly that, requesting me to explain in layman's terms how to wire auxiliary lights. And Martin, this video is the answer to your question. Although the content in this video and the principles I'll be explaining over here are not specific to any vehicle, these are general terms and design principles behind each one of the components, what they do, why they need to be used, etc. So this applies to anybody, any car, any vehicle. These are just general design principles and ideas. Now, I'm not an expert electrician, engineer, or no such thing, but these are simple terms, simple things that anybody can do. That's within the reach of anybody. Now, this is a very simplified wiring schematic of a generic 12-volt system in a car, where you have your battery that the negative terminal of the battery is hooked up directly to ground. Ground is the chassis, the body of the car, and the ground of any other consumer, any other electronic device in the car, normally is connected back to ground, which is the common return path of any electricity from the battery. That's a common return path back to negative on the battery. So whenever you see this symbol, that is the common symbol for chassis ground or body ground. Whenever you hook anything back to ground, that electricity is finding its way through the car back to the battery. So whenever you see these symbols, picture a common connection, a wire going from there right back to the negative terminal of the battery. This is your grounds. Now, normally you would have a power wire going from the battery into the cab of the vehicle to the fuse box. A fairly thick gauge wire feeding all that electricity to the fuse box, where it gets branched off by individual fuses to individual consumers. The radios, the wipers, the tail light, the horn, the fan blower, the etc. etc. One of those fuses is going to feed the headlights, going through the headlight switch and going. This is where inside of the vehicle you turn your headlights on and off, and you have another wire going from there to your headlights and then through the filaments and then back to ground. In vehicles of Martin, in your case, you mentioned you had a mid-90s Dodge, which is the Chrysler family, just like my Jeep is. My Jeep is a 94 Jeep Wrangler. So their wiring principles, they share a lot of commonalities between Dodge and Chrysler. So I'm willing to bet that your Dodge suffers from the same problems that my Jeep does, which is the problem of dim headlights. And that's because all of the current going to the headlights, being consumed by the headlights, is being fed through the headlight switch and going through this wire directly to the headlights. Over time, since all that current is going through the headlight switch, over time, it tends to overheat and get toasty and possibly leading to failure, not only of the switch, but the wire leading out to the headlights as well. The insulation can get brittle and old, and the wires can get degraded, increasing their resistance, the total resistance of the wiring going out to the headlights. That means that a lot of the electric energy coming from the battery or from the alternator, but in this case from the battery, it gets lost in transit, given off to heat and because of the increased resistance. That means that your headlights over time get dimmer and dimmer and dimmer, and you can go and replace them and install new headlights, and they're still going to be dim just because the problem is further upstream. And my Jeep suffers from that too. Now there's companies that sell pre-made wiring harnesses that add relays to the headlight harness, and in turn, basically, I'll get into the relays in a second. But anyways, that's upgrading the harness for the headlights, and that was not your question. The question is how to wire additional lights. So we'll get to that. Now, I just wanted to explain why your headlights may be dimmer than they used to be. Now, uh, one of your questions was, do you need a relay to add an additional light? Do you need a relay? And the short answer is yes. And we'll get to that in a second. Now, your other question is, how do you to add a new light, you need a new source of electricity from your fuse box. How do you attach or rob power from the fuse box? If you have an empty slot that is powered from the ignition switch, you can certainly add a fuse, but most likely you're not going to have any available slots in the fuse box that you can just plug a fuse in and then tap a wire and go from there. Normally that's not the case. What you can use to tap into power from your fuse box is there's a product that already exists that's called, I believe, add a fuse. And what it is, it's a pretty ingenious thing, a pretty smart little thing. What it is a tap that basically replaces, you would pluck out, it has about this shape and it has a wire leading out to one side. You would pluck out a fuse from your fuse box and plug this into that slot instead. And what this is, it splits off the power going from the fuse box and splits it into two fuse locations down here. So now your original fuse, would plug into here, plus an additional fuse next to it. So you would plug out the original fuse, plug it into the bottom of this, and now that still performs its function, but now it's coming down through here and back out the electricity. So that fuse is still performing its function, but what this device does, this add a fuse, is it taps into that electricity and allows, splits it, it branches off, and it adds a secondary slot for another fuse. And that power from there leaves on an additional wire. Now you have a ready-made, just by plucking out a fuse, putting it into a new slot, you add a new fuse, and now you have a ready-made connection. Not a connection, but a new wire with power ready to be used. So if you want to add a new consumer, a new addition to a fuse box, a new fuse, you would use, one of the options you have is use this add a fuse. You can Google it and buy it at any auto parts store. They're all over the place. You'll find them. Now that you have power, let's say that you're already leaving the fuse box with new power, you want that power to make it to the to your new lights. Now you need a switch, a new auxiliary switch. This is your on and off switch, mounted to your center console, to the dashboard, wherever you like. That power from there is going to go to the light, and then from the light back to ground, and eventually back into the battery. If you run the wire from here straight to your light, it's going to work, except that you're limited by the gauge of the wire and the length of wire running from the fuse box to the switch, from inside the cab all the way out to the front of the car to the light. That is a lot of wire for that electricity to go through, and it's going to lose a lot of momentum. That's a lot of resistance. Not to mention the fact that all of that current is going through the switch, so it puts a lot of wear every time you turn on and off that switch. It degrades it fairly quickly. In turn, what you can do is use a relay. This is where you introduce the relay. Now, what the relay is a remote switch. It's a switch that you control remotely, not via radio control, but remotely meaning from a distance. Now, this switch over here, you can control from your switch coming from the cab. And then from here, this would go to ground. Normal simple relays have four prongs, four legs. One is for a coil, an electromagnet, which is activated by electricity going through it. You feed electricity to it, it closes a contact. When you close a contact, you're allowing electricity from here to go to the light. I'm getting ahead of this explanation, but anyways. Now, the function of this switch is to trigger this remote switch. So the only electricity that's going, that you need to go through these little thin wires, is the electricity needed for this relay to click on, for this remote switch to activate, which is not a lot of electricity. It does not require a lot of power. Therefore, you don't need as thick gauge of a wire. You can get away with using a simple thin little wire to go from the fuse box, from your out of fuse, go from there to a switch, which you can mount wherever you want, in your center console or dashboard or wherever. You're going from the fuse, from the out of fuse, to your switch, wherever you want, from the switch, through the firewall, to the relay, under the hood, if you want to mount it under the hood, wherever, somewhere over there. And then from there to ground. That wire can be pretty thin because this does not use up a lot of electricity just to trigger the relay. Now what that allows you to do is use a thicker gauge wire, that much shorter run of wire, to go from the light to the relay, and from the relay to go from the battery, to go from the battery to the relay, and relay to the lights, to your new lights. Ideally, you want this run of wire to be as short as possible and as thick a gauge of wire as you can. The goal is to minimize resistance so that most of the electricity leaving your battery makes it to your new lights, and then make sure you have a good ground connection to allow that electricity to flow out and back into the battery. The relay, like I said, is a remote switch. Now this switch is made to allow heavy currents to flow through it. What triggers this remote switch, the relay, is this switch mounted inside the cab. This is only your trigger switch to signal this remote switch to turn on and off. Now you can wire this. Now you can wire this being the positive going to the switch and then to here back to ground, or you can wire this going from the fuse box, your positive here going to the relay, and then this the ground coming back to switch, and now you're switching the ground. In that case, the ground will be on this side. Either way you run the electricity on the relay or on the switch, either feeding positive, controlling the positive here, opening and closing the positive, or the ground, it doesn't matter. All you're doing is interrupting the flow of electricity on this side of the relay to trigger it on or off. And here, all you're doing with the switch is opening or closing electricity to trigger this switch over here. That is the function of the relay. It's a remote switch that allows for much heavier contact, and it relocates the triggering of the light, of the heavy current, closer to the light to give you a shorter path over here as possible. That is going to ensure that you get the most light output from your new lights. This At first glance, all these lines and squiggles and whatever look a little complicated, but it's very simple. It's very simple. Battery, back to ground. Thick gauge wire going from your positive of your battery to the light, being switched on and off by a relay. And that relay is being triggered, is being controlled remotely via this switch from inside the cab. This switch is getting power from the fuse box from the newly added fuse over here using the added fuse. And you can mount the switch wherever. And now all you're doing is running a wire from the added fuse to your center console or wherever you want to mount the switch. And then from there, run a switch through the firewall out to the under the hood, next to the, on a fender, on a firewall, wherever you want to mount the relay. And then from there to ground. Now you have, even if you haven't connected these wires yet, you can still trigger that relay on and off by switching that switch. On and off, you're going to hear the relay click every time you activate the switch. Now you add the power to the light. Now you have the ability to control the light. To add the power to the light, simply run a thick gauge wire from the battery to one leg of the relay, and then from the other end of the relay to the light. You're done. Now, safety, fire hazards, etc. This power going to the light is not protected. There's no fuse in here. You only have a fuse here controlling how much power this wire is going through this little wire. So if this wire ever got shaved, cut, interrupted, or when it was grounded somehow, this fuse would blow, protecting that circuit. There is, up until now, there is no protection here. This circuit here, from positive through the relay, through the light, and back to ground, there's no protection here. You need to add a fuse. You need to add a protection for safety. You don't, in case anything happens and any of these wires here get shorted out, you don't start a fire. You don't, it doesn't cause further damage. What you can use is add a fuse, and actually I happen to have one of those here. This is an example. I'm not saying to use this particular one. This is just an example. This is an inline fuse that you can add at any point along this run over here, on this side or this side. Normally you would want the fuse, the protection, as high as upstream as possible, because if you add a fuse right before the light here and you get shorted out somewhere upstream, none of this is protected. So you want that fuse to be as close to the source of electricity as possible, so that the rest of the run of the circuit, the rest of the wires, are protected downstream from that, therefore minimizing the chances of any danger, any accidents. And this inline fuse is very simple. You have a wire in, a wire out, and then a housing for a fuse. It has a protective rubber cap. This is sealed. This opens up, and you have a slot for a fuse. Just drop a fuse in there, close the cap, protect it from the elements. Bob's your uncle. Now you added a fuse. So to finalize and complete the circuit, you would go from the battery, short run, to a new fuse, and then from there to the relay, out to the light, and back to ground. All right. As you can see, it's fairly simple. I hope I've done a good enough job to explain in layman's terms how to wire a new light, an auxiliary light, into any vehicle. But anyways, if you have any other questions, or if I missed anything, let me know, and I'll try my best to answer you guys. All right, stay safe. I hope you found it useful, and see you next time. Thank you, guys.